Ever wonder why gamers rage? Is it just because they're antisocial basement dwellers with mommy issues? Not exactly. In fact, their tantrums are usually rooted in a very real part of human nature that has been with us for thousands of years. And even worse, it's only getting worse as technology improves. Before we get started, I want to clear up some misconceptions about what this video is not about. This video is not about excusing bad behavior or suggesting that anger is ever okay. It's also not an attempt to delve into the psychology of rage itself. There have already been plenty of videos on those topics, and they're both good. Instead, this video will look at the root causes of rage and how it has manifested throughout history. At its core, the desire to crush your enemies and escape justice for all your crimes is a powerful motivator. In order to understand why people rage, let's take a brief tour of the past, starting with one of the most iconic examples of tilt in history, the ancient Roman gladiator. The Roman Colosseum was the original battle royale, except instead of chicken dinners, combatants fought to the death and sometimes beyond. For the Romans, there was no such thing as a silver lining because there was no prize for second place. You either won or you died trying. A warrior who fell in battle was denied a proper burial and considered unlucky to have died away from home. His family had to pay a fee to recover his body, and even then were forbidden from giving him a traditional funeral. Dying as a gladiator was shameful, a fate reserved for slaves and foreigners. The crowds jeered and cheered as men hacked each other to pieces, gored each other with spears, and ripped each other's limbs off with hooks. In this environment, losing meant far more than just dying. It meant dying a coward's death, being denied a warrior's burial, and having your loved ones shamed for their family members' failure. No wonder gladiators were so angry. Their life depended on winning, and if they didn't, they'd be scorned for eternity. But the stakes weren't only high for the gladiators. Winning the fight meant money, fame, and women for the victors. So the crowd's cheers could be deafening. The loudest roar would be reserved for the final kill, when the victor raised his sword above his head and shouted "Veni, Vidi Vici," which translates roughly to "I came, I saw, I conquered." But for the losers, the crowd wasn't quite so generous with their praise. If you lost your fight, the spectators would hurl insults and rotten fruit while you got dragged out of the arena by your ankles, still breathing but broken. The ultimate humiliation was to be forced to fight an opponent who was too strong for them. Imagine facing down an entire team of pro players in Call of Duty after a decade of playing against bots. What would your KDA be? But this kind of crushing defeat was only possible because the defeated gladiator had previously won. After all, you had to win battles to earn the right to face off in the final match. But that also meant that when the crowd saw a fighter lose, they knew that he used to be good. They wanted to believe that the man before them was a fallen hero, someone who used to be great but had somehow gotten worse. The Romans would boo and hiss and chant, "Give me the thumbs up, the thumbs down," which gave the signal to the emperor or the host of the games to decide the loser's fate. If you got the thumbs up, you survived. And if you got the thumbs down, you died. Now imagine if the host decided to stream the games on Twitch. Suddenly the whole world is watching, and every insult and piece of rotten fruit has 10 times the impact. Now imagine if instead of fighting with swords and shields, you were fighting with keyboards and mice. Bam, welcome to modern day gaming, where anyone can be a spectator and everyone has an opinion. But how did this carry over to nonviolent sports? Well, almost everything is a competition these days, and everything is recorded. Thanks to technology, there is no shortage of clips showing moments of utter humiliation, like the time Dennis Rodman made Michael Jordan cry, or the time LeBron James got dunked on. But while humiliating defeats happen in every sport, not every athlete throws a tantrum. Why do some people handle defeat like little children and others walk away like graceful adults? Let's examine 2 factors, ego and shame. As humans, our sense of self-worth is intimately tied to our ability to perform. This is called self-esteem based on mastery, and it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors needed to be able to hunt and gather efficiently. Otherwise, their tribe would go hungry and their genes would die out. Someone who couldn't pull their weight would be kicked out of the tribe and left to die, literally. So being good at what you do kept you alive and ensured the continuation of your bloodline. In today's world, we don't get kicked out of our tribes for missing a few baskets or losing a few games. But our brains haven't evolved to reflect that. We still feel the same sense of urgency and threat, which means that our ego is still tied to our performance. But we're not just fighting for our survival anymore. We're fighting for status, respect, and money. And all of these things are much more difficult to obtain now that everyone is competing for them. Just think about how many hours you put into improving your skills so that you could become better than your friends. Or how many times you stayed up late playing ranked matches instead of sleeping. Now imagine throwing away a game that you could have easily won. Suddenly, you remember all the hours you spent grinding for nothing. Your brain reacts as if your life was actually in danger. It releases adrenaline and other chemicals that make you feel extremely emotional and physical pain. And the stronger the opponent, the more painful the loss feels. But there is another factor at play as well, shame. Most people don't talk about this because they think it as pathetic to admit that they get upset over video games. And that's a form of shame. The shame of admitting that something as trivial as a video game could affect your emotions. But this shame doesn't have to control you. It's important to talk about it because it affects us all. We should not be ashamed of feeling emotions, even negative ones. It's impossible to always be happy or positive, and pretending that we can is unhealthy. But the problem arises when you let these emotions control you instead of the other way around. You can overcome the shame of feeling negative emotions by acknowledging them and learning to control them. It sounds simple, but it's effective. Most people try to bury their negative feelings instead of dealing with them. They get angry in private and then wonder why they cut and sleep at night or why their relationships are failing. But the answer is simple. Suppressing your emotions doesn't make them go away. It only makes them grow. It's like shoving a ball underwater. It might stay down there for a while, but eventually it pops back up with a lot of force. On the other hand, if you bring the ball to the surface slowly, it's not going to make a big splash. To learn how to control your emotions, you need to understand why they're happening in the first place. And the reason often comes down to ego and shame. Think about the last time you were humiliated in front of others. How did it make you feel? What did you want to do next? Chances are you wanted to lash out and hurt the person who shamed you, whether physically or emotionally. But doing that would only make things worse. So the best thing to do is to simply ignore the person and move on. Easier said than done, right? In the heat of the moment, it's not easy to detach yourself from your emotions. But once you calm down, you'll realize that the satisfaction you felt after destroying your enemy wasn't worth it. At that point, you can choose to walk away and avoid the toxic situation entirely. You may feel sad or disappointed, but those are much better emotions than rage or hatred. So the next time you're playing your favorite video game and you're losing badly, ask yourself, why am I so angry? Is it really worth ruining my night over? Probably not. It's just a game and it's not worth sacrificing your mental health over. Instead, focus on having fun. If you're not having fun, then stop playing. There's no point in continuing if you're not enjoying it. Some of this stuff is gonna sound kind of crazy, but stay with me because by the end of the video, I think it's gonna make sense. We're gonna start out talking about samurai and then move into some modern examples. So the Japanese code of the samurai, known as Bushido, had some rules around conduct and behavior that were extremely important for the samurai to follow. It was very important for them to have composure at all times. In fact, losing your composure was actually seen as being quite shameful. And what would cause a samurai to lose their composure? Well, there are many things. One of the biggest causes of a samurai losing their composure was if they were defeated in battle. If a samurai was defeated in battle, it meant that they had failed to protect their honor and their family's honor. There's a famous quote from Miyamoto Musashi that goes, "When you fight, you must take your opponent's life. When you retreat, you must die." What does that mean? Well, it means that if you're a samurai and you run away from battle, well, you're basically dead. Not only do you live with the shame of losing the battle, but now people are going to call you a coward. People will point at you and say, "Hey, that guy ran away from his fight." Now, if you were to go back into the fight after running away and you were able to defeat the opponent, sure, you could redeem yourself, but this doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, once a samurai loses their cool, their mind essentially just shuts down. They can't function anymore. They become useless. This is called getting tilted, but it's not just limited to gaming. It happens in all aspects of life. How many times have you been so angry that you felt like giving up? How many times has anger caused you to feel completely helpless? How many times has it caused you to feel like you want to just curl up in a ball and disappear? Maybe you felt like this after getting made fun of by your peers, getting rejected by someone you like, or maybe even being beaten by an opponent in a game or in a sport. Whatever it is, that feeling is completely normal. But there is a reason why we feel this way, and that reason is something that has been passed down from our ancestors and has been ingrained into our DNA. You see, humans have been humiliated in public long before the internet. And one of the worst feelings that we can experience is the feeling of public humiliation. And when we feel humiliated, we don't just feel bad on the inside. Our bodies react physically as well. In fact, the human body reacts physically to shame in the same way that it reacts physically to pain. Humans are wired to feel shame, and our bodies are programmed to respond to that feeling. Shame has been a part of the human experience for as long as we've been around, and it's no wonder why. After all, we're social creatures who rely on the approval of others to survive. When we violate social norms or make mistakes in front of others, we can feel ashamed. And when we feel ashamed, we're reminded that we're not perfect and that we're not accepted. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, great. So I'm wired to feel shame. That's interesting. But what does that have to do with raging? Well, let's move on to the next topic. Ancient Rome wasn't just a place of gladiators and emperors, but also a hotbed for gambling. Gambling was a favorite pastime for the Roman citizens, and it was especially popular during the reign of Caligula. Gambling was everywhere. You could gamble on chariot races, on gladiatorial combats, on hunting wild animals, on dice games, and even on athletic competitions. But it wasn't just the common folk who loved to gamble. Caligula himself was known to be a big fan. He loved nothing more than throwing lavish gambling parties where he would invite 8 men of only one type, bald, short, or fat. He would roll the dice with the reckless abandon of a man who had too much money and too much time on his hands. Historians tell us that he would lose so much money in these gambling bouts that his coffers would run dry in a matter of days. So much so that he would even sell off chariots and horses, confiscate property from temples, and strip prostitutes of their finery, just so that he could keep the party going. One night during one of these infamous gambling sessions, Caligula got into a massive fight with one of his courtiers, a man named Cornelius Balbus. The two men were playing a dice game, and Caligula, as was his habit, started to lose. He became enraged and threw the dice at Balbus, hitting him in the eye. Balbus retaliated by pushing the emperor over. This was too much for Caligula. He drew his dagger and slashed Balbus across the face, leaving a scar that would forever mar the courtier's good looks. This wasn't the first time that Caligula had gotten violent while gambling. He had a reputation for losing his cool when the games didn't go his way. In fact, there was another incident where he killed a gladiator because he wasn't fighting well enough to his liking, but as bad as Caligula was, he wasn't the worst. There was a Roman emperor who took things to a whole other level. Meet Elagabalus, a young man who took the throne at the age of 18 and quickly established himself as a debauched and spoiled teenager. While most teenagers are busy worrying about school and fitting in, Elagabalus was throwing gold coins from a tower, enjoying the sight of common folk fighting over the riches. He hosted wild chariot races in taverns, crashed weddings, and whipped up chariot drivers as they raced around the Circus Maximus. But his worst vice was gambling. He couldn't stop. He would gamble away his mother's jewels and the money that was supposed to pay the Praetorian Guard. He was arrested several times by his own grandmother, Julia Misa. Then came the incident with the gladiator. One day, Elagabalus decided that he wanted to be entertained. So he went to the gladiator barracks and picked out a handsome young gladiator named Berenice. He chained Berenice up in the courtyard and started whipping him. The crowd of spectators joined in, each taking a turn at beating the poor gladiator. Finally, Berenice succumbed to his wounds, and when the emperor saw that the gladiator was dead, he just laughed. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He ordered the body thrown into the Tiber River and went back to his debauchery. These stories of Caligula and Elagabalus show us how powerful the urge to rage can be. Even someone as powerful as a Roman emperor can't help but feel the need to lash out when they lose control. But why do we feel this way? Why do we feel so strongly when we lose? Well, the answer lies in the reptilian part of our brain, the amygdala. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe of the brain. It's responsible for processing emotions, particularly those related to survival, such as fear and aggression. The amygdala is highly active when we feel threatened or in danger, and it triggers the release of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol, which cause our heart rate to increase, our muscles to tense up, and our bodies to prepare for fight or flight. It's this ancient part of our brain that's responsible for our rage. The amygdala is especially active when we replaying games because games are designed to trigger our survival instincts. They put us in situations where we have to make quick decisions and fight for our lives. And when we feel like we're in danger, our amygdala takes over and we act without thinking. We lash out at the nearest enemy, we throw our weapons wildly, and we do whatever we can to survive. And it's not just our amygdala that's involved in our rage. Our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and social behavior, is also activated when we're gaming. The prefrontal cortex helps us to regulate our emotions and make rational decisions, but it can be overridden by the amygdala when we feel threatened. This is why sometimes we say things that we didn't mean or do things that we later regret. Our prefrontal cortex is trying to keep us calm and rational, but our amygdala is driving us to lash out. So the next time you find yourself getting angry and losing control, remember that you're not alone. It's just your brain doing what it was designed to do. It's your amygdala taking over and making sure that you survive. It's your ancestors' way of ensuring that you don't get left behind. So I hope this has given you some insight into why gamers rage. I know it can be frustrating and embarrassing at times, but it's just part of the human experience. It's what makes us human. We're going to talk about why people get so angry when they lose at games. And in particular, we are going to talk about what part of your brain is in control, when that happens, and how that relates to a much longer time scale than just gaming or even being human. Now, this question of why people get so upset when they lose at video games is one that has been asked by outsiders to the hobby for a long time now. It's an extremely common meme to show a gamer getting angry at a video game, often with the implication that they're more upset than is reasonable. This stereotype has some truth to it, but it is also really important to remember that the vast majority of gamers are not raging maniacs, and that gaming is a completely normal and healthy hobby, but still, the stereotype exists for a reason. So let's talk about why people tilt. But before we do, I want to thank all of our supporters, especially our Omegas. Your support allows us to make these videos for everyone. As many of you know, I am a neuroscientist by background, and so thinking about rage from a biological perspective has always been kind of interesting to me. So let's talk about the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is a group of structures in the brain that are involved in processing emotion and memory. One of the most well-known parts of the limbic system is the amygdala, which is involved in processing fear and anger. In fact, there was a famous case of a patient known as Esm, who had damage to her amygdala, and she was essentially unable to experience fear. When you're playing a competitive video game, your amygdala is going to become active if you're losing, because your brain is trying to figure out how to avoid the negative feelings that come up when you lose. The amygdala doesn't actually produce emotions, but instead drives you to seek out behaviors that will decrease the likelihood that you feel those negative emotions. In the case of a video game, you might play a certain champion or character, or you might only play during certain hours, or you might avoid playing against certain opponents. These behaviors may be conscious or unconscious, but either way, the amygdala is the part of your brain that you can thank for why you tend to play the same champion in League of Legends, or why you only fire up your console when you have plenty of time to play. As far as the evolutionary history of the amygdala goes, animals have been experiencing emotions like fear and anger for hundreds of millions of years. Even simple invertebrates like jellyfish and sea slugs have something called an analog of the amygdala, and they use it to respond appropriately to threats in their environment. In more complex animals like mammals, the amygdala is large enough to influence behavior directly. In humans, the amygdala is even bigger and has enough connections to other parts of the brain to be able to influence our thoughts and memories as well as our behavior. Essentially, if you didn't have an amygdala, you wouldn't be able to learn from experience and would constantly find yourself having to relearn the same lessons. Of course, when you're losing at a video game, it's not life or death, but rather a mild inconvenience that can be easily fixed by clicking a few buttons. Still, our brains haven't really evolved beyond our ancestors who are still dealing with saber-toothed tigers. So sometimes that tiny part of your brain that is in charge of fear can overreact to losing at. Overwatch 2, that is definitely part of the story, but it's not the whole story. If you've ever lost a game and felt tears stinging your eyes, or felt like you couldn't stop shaking, then you know that intense feelings can accompany losing at video games. So what else is going on in your brain? In addition to the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex is also active when you're losing at a game. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision-making, attention, and social behavior. Basically, it is the part of your brain that allows you to function in society without accidentally slapping people in the face or screaming at them in the middle of a grocery store. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop, which is probably why teenagers are so impulsive. If you're young and don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, you may be more likely to take risks or engage in other behaviors that aren't always socially acceptable. Now, the prefrontal cortex is pretty important when it comes to regulating our emotions. So if you're feeling a lot of negative emotions while playing a video game, your prefrontal cortex should step in and help you take a deep breath, relax, and maybe even laugh it off. But if you're particularly competitive or if you've had a rough day already, that might not happen. The prefrontal cortex takes a lot of energy to run, and it can't always keep up with the amygdala, especially if you've already been stressed out by things like work or school. Maybe you're in a toxic work environment and your boss is always yelling at you for no reason. You come home and want to unwind by playing some Apex Legends, but it just makes you more anxious and you start to tilt. Then if you've had enough, you rage quit and spend the night doom scrolling on Twitter, which makes you even more upset so you can't fall asleep. By the end of the night, your prefrontal cortex has been pushed to its limit and your amygdala has taken over. In this state, your limbic system starts to take control of your behavior and the prefrontal cortex, as attempts to regulate your emotions, fail. Your heart starts racing, your breathing becomes more rapid, and you start to sweat. You clench your fists and you yell at the screen because right now, your brain is in survival mode and all of those years of evolution are taking over. This is why you might find yourself saying, "Get out of here, you dirty cheater," even though you know that the person on the other side of the screen is just another gamer trying to have fun. Now, in general, this process of the limbic system taking over your higher functions isn't unique to gaming. It happens to all of us every single day and can be triggered by relatively minor inconveniences. But for some people, the stakes of a video game are high enough that when they start to tilt, they can't stop themselves from acting on those base instincts until the fight or flight response kicks in. That said, humans have been playing games long before there were video games. So the question remains, why do we get so worked up about losing at games? The answer, as is so often the case, can be found in our distant past. Let's talk about chess. Chess is an extremely popular game that originated in India more than 1500 years ago. It's a game of strategy that requires a lot of concentration and planning ahead. But chess isn't just played for fun. It's also a competitive game with professional players who compete for prizes and recognition. Now, there's an old story about a master chess player who was once defeated by his student. The student had learned from his teacher's techniques and was able to defeat him in a tournament. After the game, the master became so upset that he fell down dead of a heart attack. Of course, this is an extreme example, but it illustrates the incredible intensity that chess can bring out in even the most level-headed people. Now, chess is an extremely complicated game that involves a lot of moving parts, but the basic idea is pretty simple. You have a king that you need to protect, and your goal is to capture your opponent's king. Over the course of several thousand years, chess has evolved into a highly refined game of strategy and tactics. But the basic premise has remained the same. Now let's go back in time to ancient India. Back then, chess was known as chaturanga, and it wasn't played with pieces on a board, but with real soldiers on a battlefield. Each player controlled an army, and the goal of the game was to capture the other player's king. Just like in modern chess, the king was the most important piece on the board, and the goal of the game was to capture him. Now, war is a serious business. Soldiers put their lives on the line every day, and kings often lost their heads quite literally. So when the king was captured, the game was over and the victor could claim the defeated king's territory. In other words, chess used to be a game where the stakes could not be higher. Over the centuries, Cheturang became less violent and was eventually transformed into the game we know today. But that long history of violence hasn't been forgotten. In fact, it's encoded in our DNA. So the next time you're replaying a video game and you start to get a little too upset when you lose, remember that you're tapping into a very long history of human behavior. In a sense, you're reliving the glory days of ancient warfare when kings went head-to-head on the battlefield. Rage isn't new. It's a reflex we've inherited from millions of years of public failure and perceived injustice. We can trace this behavior back to our animal ancestors, but it really starts to take shape when humans entered the scene. I want to start with something a little personal. When I was 7 years old, I lost my mom. I was an only child without any other close family nearby. So I went to live with my dad's parents, my grandparents, who I barely knew. And suddenly, in a moment, I had to become the most important person in the life of a 75-year-old man. I don't remember what I expected would happen next, but it wasn't this. As time passed, I started to realize that there was no one else who would take care of me, so I might as well try to take care of myself. In some ways, I think this made me grow up fast. I learned how to cook because I didn't want my grandpa to do it for me. And I learned how to handle conflict because there was no one else who would do it for him. But it also filled me with a lot of anxiety. When I was about 14, I started to date girls. And one day, my girlfriend broke up with me over the phone. She said she needed someone stronger, smarter, more handsome. And then she hung up before I could say anything. I felt my heart break. This wasn't like me. Why would someone not want to be with me? What was wrong with me? Maybe if I could just prove to her that I was strong or smart enough, she'd come back. A few days later, I was at a party with some friends, and a guy named Trevor came up to me while I was talking to a girl, and he looked me up and down. He shook his head and said, "You're not good enough for her." I instantly felt anger bubble up inside of me. What did he know about me? About what I was going through? What did he know about love? Nothing. And before I knew it, I was lunging at him, screaming, trying to smash my fist into his face. My friends pulled me off of him, and Trevor walked away laughing. As they held me back, I could feel my whole body shaking with effort as I screamed and shouted for them to let me go. And when they finally did, I ran after Trevor. But as I got closer, I could see that all of my anger and energy was spent. There was nothing left. I was tired. I stumbled out a string of curses, and he just kept laughing. Then he turned around and walked away. It took me a long time to understand why I reacted that way. I thought that proving myself to my girlfriend would make her love me. But the reality is that my anger was coming from a place of shame. I felt weak and broken and worthless, and I wanted to prove to everyone that I wasn't. One of the ways people have always tried to prove their worth is through trial by combat, which dates back to the Code of Hammurabi in 1750 BC. If two people had a dispute, they would each swear an oath and call witnesses. But if the judge still couldn't figure out who was right, they would fight. In the Middle Ages, the concept of trial by combat really took shape. It was called trial by ordeal. Ordeals were designed to weed out liars. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm. People were thrown into cold water, and if they sank, they were guilty. They had hot lead or boiling oil poured on them. If they survived, they were innocent. They were even suspended by chains and hooks over a fire. If they confessed or dropped their guard and fell into the flames, they were guilty. Otherwise, they were innocent. These trials weren't really fair, but they were better than the alternatives. If your accuser could prove that they were telling the truth, you were found guilty. And as punishment, you were put to death. You could either submit to whatever punishment the king deemed fit, or you could choose trial by combat. If you chose trial by combat and won, you were acquitted. If you won, it meant that God was on your side. The problem was, though, if you lost. Before the duel began, you were given a choice, and quartered or do you want to die by the sword? Either way, you died. Gamers today are often seen raging in public, screaming and shouting because they've lost. This behavior has been normalized to a point, but the truth is, it's actually pretty messed up. Public displays of rage are a sign of a very real mental health issue, something that researchers are still struggling to understand, but it's definitely something. The evolutionary roots of rage can be traced back to our earliest ancestors. As animals, we're predisposed to experience emotions like fear, anger, and sadness. But these emotions look different across species. For example, fear might cause a mouse to run away from a cat, while sadness might cause a monkey to seek comfort from its troop. Emotions help creatures adapt to their environments. They provide motivation for everything from finding food to attracting a mate. For early humans, emotions played a vital role in group dynamics. Being kicked out of your group meant you'd be vulnerable and probably die. A lot of our ancestors' conflicts revolved around social issues like power, territory, and mating rights. Violence was common, and those who couldn't defend themselves would be exploited by others. Humans developed rage as a tool for survival, a way of defending themselves and their groups. Rage is an intense, overwhelming emotion that can cause physical and psychological changes. It can increase blood flow, heart rate, and breathing, making you stronger and more alert. Some psychologists believe that the development of language helped fuel the evolution of rage. Language allows us to express our needs and wants, but it also helps us plan ahead. This means we can ruminate on events, rehashing them in our minds to assign blame or rehearse future confrontations. But humans are also capable of experiencing guilt and shame. When we do something wrong, we might feel terrible. We know we've violated social norms or hurt someone's feelings. But this is where things get interesting. Our ancestors didn't just feel positive emotions when they won and negative ones when they lost. They also experienced a spectrum of emotions when they witnessed other people winning or losing. This empathy allowed our ancestors to form alliances and accomplish more together than they could alone, but it also created a dark side. If you lost, it wasn't just your own disappointment that you had to deal with, but also the disappointment of everyone who supported you. Humans have always competed with each other, not just for limited resources, but for status, power, and recognition. Losing a competition could bring shame on you and your group. When you lost, it wasn't just you who had failed. Everyone who believed in you had failed too. If you were the leader, the expectations were even higher. If you lost, it was seen as a sign of weakness. Not only did you fail to meet the expectations of your group, but you failed to live up to the standards of your position. To understand why gamers rage, we have to consider the strange cultural context of gaming. Gaming was once niche activity enjoyed by a select few. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Tournaments draw in millions of viewers, and professional players compete for millions of dollars in prize money. All of this attention comes with massive expectations. If a pro player makes a mistake that costs their team the game, they'll be scrutinized by fans, media, and sponsors. They'll be blamed for losing millions of dollars. People who play games casually experience smaller stakes, but the same basic emotions. If a gamer feels like they aren't living up to their own expectations or the expectations of their friends, they might feel shame. It might feel like they're bringing their team down or holding their friends back. This is where rage enters the picture. Gamers might rage to overcome feelings of shame, to prove to themselves and others that they're worthy. They might want to show that they belong, that they're not weak. They might be trying to compensate for perceived slights or prove that they're not losers. But here's the thing, no matter how hard they try, they can't win every time. And the feeling of loss isn't just disappointing, it's painful. It brings up a whole host of emotions that we've evolved to feel throughout our entire history. And sometimes these emotions manifest themselves as rage. As for me, I'm older now and hopefully wiser. I still feel emotions when I lose at a video game, but I've learned how to control them. I've found ways to cope with my feelings of shame and inadequacy. I've accepted that I will never be the strongest or smartest guy in the room, and that's okay. So the next time you see someone angrily ranting at their TV, maybe don't laugh or point. Instead, remember that they're just another person trying to find their place in a crazy world. I know you've all seen it before. You just watched your favorite team throw away a 20-point lead in the last 3 minutes of a game, and your friend just rage quits. He throws his headset on the floor and screams at the TV for several minutes. But why do gamers rage? Why does your friend react so poorly to losing a video game? What makes people rage? Well, believe it or not, this is a question that has plagued philosophers for centuries. After all, if we are truly rational beings, then why do we allow ourselves to become overwhelmed with emotions? Well, after speaking with a number of psychologists, the answer appears to be pretty simple. We don't. You see, there are two competing schools of thought when it comes to understanding human emotion. The first is rational choice theory, which posits that people make conscious decisions about how they respond to their environment. And the second is evolutionary psychology, which suggests that people, as behaviors and feelings, are the result of adaptations to the environment that worked well enough for our ancestors. Now, depending on who you ask, one of these theories will explain most human behavior. But when it comes to rage specifically, it's important to understand that while we may have some control over our reactions, many of our more intense emotions were literally hard-coded into us millions of years ago. So to understand why gamers rage, let's go back to the beginning. Thousands of years ago, life was scary. Whether it was rival tribes looking to steal your food, wild animals looking to eat you, or the constant struggle to find enough resources to survive, our primitive ancestors needed every advantage they could get, and one of those advantages was rage. You see, in order to succeed in this prehistoric world, humans had to develop ways to cope with adversity. And what better way to overcome an obstacle than by feeling intense emotions? Anger, fear, and sadness all served a purpose. In fact, researchers peg the evolution of these emotions as a key factor in the development of the modern human brain. More specifically, our limbic system, which houses the parts of our brain responsible for controlling emotion, developed significantly during the Pleistocene epoch between 2.6 million and 11,700 years ago. During this time, the Earth was covered in ice sheets and humans lived in small scattered groups across the planet. Life was incredibly tough, and our ancestors had to contend with dangerous predators, harsh weather, and dwindling food supplies. As such, the limbic system developed as a way to help humans survive in this hostile environment. Today, it is largely agreed upon that the evolution of this part of the brain allowed humans to cooperate in larger groups, which helped our species spread across the globe. Simply put, without the limbic system, humans probably wouldn't exist. But while our limbic system is responsible for some very positive attributes, it also instilled one of humanity's greatest flaws, ego. You see, in addition to helping us cooperate in large groups, our limbic system also programmed us to compete for dominance within those groups. This innate desire to be the alpha male led to the evolution of our prefrontal cortex, which gave humans the ability to plan, strategize, and manipulate others. While this certainly contributed to humanity's rise to the top of the food chain, it also created an inherent conflict between the primitive parts of our brain and our newer, more complex systems. As we grow older, the prefrontal cortex develops and gains influence over the more primitive parts of our brain. This allows us to gain perspective, think critically, and make logical decisions. However, sometimes this process doesn't work quite right, especially when we lose at something. Like we mentioned earlier, the development of our limbic system can be traced back to the need to overcome obstacles in our environment. And one of the biggest obstacles we could face was public humiliation. Back in our caveman days, being banished from your group meant almost certain death. And what better way to ensure that outcome than by making the whole experience as humiliating as possible? This is why nearly all humans have an intense emotional response to rejection. It triggers our fight or flight response, which prepares our bodies to either confront the source of our anxiety or escape it altogether. However, this response is entirely dependent on whether or not we feel like we had control over the situation. If we did, then it's much easier for us to move past the initial emotional response and accept the situation. But if we feel like the situation was forced upon us, then our amygdala takes over and turns up the volume on our anger and frustration, and that's why we rage. Our lizard brains convince us that we're being persecuted and we feel compelled to lash out. So when a gamer loses a match, Their prefrontal cortex might tell them that it's no big deal and that they'll win next time. But their limbic system disagrees. It screams at the gamer that they're being attacked and the only way to defend themselves is to rage even harder. So you can imagine that throughout history, these emotional outbursts would have been even more extreme. For example, during World War I, soldiers would play poker and other card games in the trenches to pass the time. One British soldier recalled, "We played euchre and poker and dominoes and cigarettes. We were doing that all the time. It was really the only pleasure we got." But while games might seem like a healthy distraction from the horrors of war, they were actually another source of tension for the soldiers. After all, many of the games they played required a significant amount of skill and strategy, which made it all the more frustrating when someone tried to cheat. In fact, in 1916, an Australian soldier named John Simpson was killed after he accused his friend of cheating during a poker game. While the incident didn't result in any criminal charges, it did highlight the lengths to which soldiers would go to win a game. In the end, they simply couldn't handle the stress of losing. And while things have definitely come a way since then, the problem still persists today. Take, for example, the 2014 FIFA World Cup. After Germany defeated Argentina to win the championship, their fans stormed the field and began celebrating. However, when the referee blew the whistle to end the game, several Argentine players began crying. They couldn't believe they had lost and were overcome with emotion. Some even blamed their teammates for throwing the game. Of course, we'd all like to think that we're above such petulant behavior, but the truth is that we all succumb to tilt from time to time. Whether it's a heated game of Monopoly with your family or getting flamed by a 12-year-old on Call of Duty, everyone gets tilted from time to time. It's just part of the human condition. However, some people are more prone to tilt than others, and that usually boils down to one personality trait: lack of self-awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to recognize and understand your own emotions and how they affect others. And studies have shown that people with low levels of self-awareness are more likely to experience negative emotions like anger and frustration. They're also less able to regulate those emotions once they start to feel them. This is because the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for regulating emotions, requires a high degree of self-awareness in order to function properly. So if you're not in tune with your own emotions, then your prefrontal cortex won't be able to keep your lizard brain in check. But before we wrap up, we want to say that tilt isn't always a bad thing. In fact, sometimes it can be beneficial. For example, in a job that requires a lot of physical strength, like construction or mining, workers who experience tilt are more likely to get injured. On the other hand, in jobs that require a lot of mental effort, like programming or writing, tilt can actually be beneficial. That's because tilt can increase our focus and make us more productive, at least in the short term. Ultimately, it's all about moderation. Everyone experiences tilt from time to time, but it's how you deal with it that matters. If you're able to use tilt to your advantage, then it can actually be helpful. But if you let it control you, then it can be destructive. So the next time you feel yourself getting tilted, take a step back and assess the situation. Is it really worth getting upset over? Will it make a difference in the long run? And if the answers to those questions are no, then just relax and enjoy the game. After all, that's what it's all about. Have you ever wondered why gamers rage? I mean, really rage? What is it about video games that make people lose their minds? Why do they scream and swear and smash things when they lose? I'm not talking about that quiet, simmering rage that all of us feel when we're defeated by a cheap trick or a glitch in the system. I'm talking about that glorious, spectacular rage that makes you want to throw your keyboard across the room. Well, it turns out that this particular brand of rage has been with us for thousands of years. It just took the right combination of technology and psychology to make it bloom into the full-throated tirades that we hear today. So if you think that gaming rage is just an inevitable result of having too many immature weenies playing video games, think again. You might be surprised to learn that even our ancestors felt a little ragey from time to time. But where does this anger come from, and how did it evolve into the beautiful thing that we know and love today? Well, to understand the origins of rage, we have to go back to one of humanity's greatest inventions, the Atari Punk console. No, seriously, that's where we have to start, because the explosion of arcade gaming in the 80s created a whole new world of high-score chasers who were prone to spectacular outbursts of rage when they got beat. And the thing is, these outbursts weren't considered rageful back then. They were seen as expressions of skill. Back in the day, people would play a game like Pac-Man until they had legitimately mastered it, meaning they could get further than anyone else and reliably rack up higher scores than their friends. And the highest scores didn't just earn them bragging rights, they became enshrined in the machine. The arcade was filled with high-score tables, and watching someone else get their name added to the list with their very own initials, seared into the metal like some kind of cybernetic brand, was genuinely upsetting. Tilt was often caused by a rude comment from another player who was trying to distract you while you played so they could snatch your high score away from you. In fact, the word tilt comes directly from these arcade games. Back then, when a player got upset enough to turn off the machine out of frustration, they were said to have tilted. And this wasn't a solitary activity. Tilting was also more likely when someone was close to achieving a big milestone, like reaching the next level or passing a certain amount of points. Because when you're close to hitting a major milestone and you mess up, that's when the rage starts to boil inside of you. The same exact thing happens today when you get ganked while you re-carrying your team to victory, or when you've spent hours trying to beat a boss fight, but you accidentally hit the wrong button and die at the last possible moment. These situations are prime rage-inducing territory, and it turns out that this emotional response to defeat has been around since long before we even had video games. In fact, it goes back thousands of years to ancient Rome, where there was a kind of entertainment known as the ludus gladiatorum. In modern English, the ludus gladiatorum would probably be called something like gladiator training games. They were basically like a Romang's favorite pastime. The goal of the game was to use skill and strategy to defeat your opponent, and the stakes were pretty high. If you lost, you might have to fight in a real gladiatorial match where you risk getting stabbed to death. The best part of the ludus gladiatorum is that there was a scoring system to determine the victor. Similar to modern esports tournaments, the players would keep track of the number of wins and losses for each person and teams. And just like in video games, this led to an intense desire to win every single match and claim the title of the most skilled gladiator trainer in the city. But if the ludus gladiatorum sounds familiar, that's probably because it inspired one of the most popular sports of the modern era, wrestling. And while professional wrestling is obviously fake, it still produces the same kind of emotions that a spectator sport can bring out in us. Watching our favorite wrestler dominate their opponents and climb to the top of the card is a great way to escape from reality for a few hours. But it can be just as devastating to watch them fall. If you've ever watched a wrestler you get beaten by a trick or a cheap shot, you know exactly what I mean. There's a reason why wrestling fans will boo a sneaky maneuver like this. Scientists have found that it's tied to our brain's inability to cope with regret. It is the same reason that we hate it when a player scores a winning point in a tennis match by tripping over their own feet, or when a basketball player gets fouled while shooting a three-pointer and all of those pixels line up perfectly so he gets the points anyway. It doesn't matter if the action is legal. We still feel cheated when a player wins by accident. This phenomenon even has its own name, sour grapes. It's the tendency for people to belittle something that they can't have. And it turns out that this instinct is completely natural. When something good happens by accident, our brain can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had done that instead. And they let their feelings be known. And this can lead to feelings of resentment and rage. Of course, there's no such thing as a clean victory in the world of professional wrestling. Cheating is rampant, and sometimes a fighter will literally tear off their mask and reveal that they were actually a totally different person who looks identical to them. That is essentially what happened in the battle of the century between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Except this time the fans wanted the ref to count to 3 instead of 2. Of course, the match was eventually restarted, but the damage was already done. So you can imagine how common it was for fans to feel outraged or even betrayed when their hero lost a match. Fans would flood the ring after a match, grabbing the fallen wrestler to make sure that they were okay, which was both sweet and terrifying. But they would also launch into a rage of their own if they thought the match was unfair. They would hurl insults, rocks, and sometimes even bottles at the winner and demand a rematch. Sounds familiar, right? Now you might be wondering why anyone would boo the biggest match in wrestling history, but the answer is simple. The fans just felt like they got robbed of the outcome they expected. People still complained about this match decades later. For example, 4 is divisible by 2 and 2. The point is that humans have always felt angry when they believe they've been wronged. Whether it's in a gladiator match, a wrestling ring, a board game, or an online video game, the sensation is the same, and that's why gamers rage. It's just another example of our age-old response to perceived injustice. After that, they pupate and emerge as adult cicadas. And I'm not saying that this rage is healthy or productive. It's just part of the human condition. So the next time you see someone throwing a tantrum at an online game, don't judge them too hard. They may have just witnessed the greatest upset in the history of that particular leaderboard. Okay, now here are some fun facts about the number 2. Did you know that 2 is the only even prime number? A prime number is a whole number greater than 1 that has only 2 divisors. And 2 is the only one that's even. All other even numbers are divisible by 2 and another number. Now here's a weird fact about the no 3. Did you know that there's a species of beetle that's called the 3-day larva? These larvae live inside of the bodies of cicadas, and they only live for 3 days. Tilt, rage, meltdown, tantrum. These are all words we use to describe when a person's competitive spirit gets the better of them. But why do they tilt? What's it about losing that causes some people to lash out or even cry? Is it really just because they can't admit defeat? Well, it's more complicated than that. In fact, a huge part of why gamers get so emotional over video games is because of our long history with them. And I don't mean like the history of video games as an industry or a piece of interactive entertainment. I mean the much longer history of our brains and bodies as living things on this planet, how that relates to gaming in general, not a specific game and how it ties into your psychology. So buckle up for a history lesson as we explore where gamer rage comes from. Rage isn't new. It's not something that has developed alongside video games. Our brain is hardwired with a rage reflex going back millions of years. It's there in the reptile part of our brain, the same part responsible for fight or flight. When it kicks in, there's a massive release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that pump into your system, heart rate goes up, blood rushes to your muscles. Your vision narrows, focusing only on what's immediately in front of you. All of this is happening at a subconscious level without you even knowing about it. This evolutionary response is designed to help us overcome physical threats. The feeling of anger itself is also hardwired in our brain, and it's meant to be a catalyst for action. It's there to motivate us to confront the source of our frustration and put things right. At its core, rage is a tool for survival. But like any emotion, if it's not kept in check, it can cause problems. We know that prolonged exposure to high levels of stress hormones isn't good for us. It can contribute to anxiety, depression, cardiovascular disease, and other physical ailments. In the same way, unchecked anger issues can lead to aggression and violence. So now that we understand how anger works on a biological level, let's try and figure out why it comes out in the form of rage when playing video games. To answer that question, we need to go back to the days of yore. Like 6,000 years ago, when humans started playing a game called Royal 8, which was played with cow bones and was pretty much the ancient equivalent of snake eyes. Before psychologists and sports scientists were figuring out how human cognition works, people have been playing competitive games for fun and bragging rights for thousands of years. And with that, developing a concept of winning and losing and everything that comes along with it. You see, losing is painful. Of course, this is especially true when there's a lot at stake. And in a game, depending on the stakes, losing can mean losing face, losing respect, losing your life. For most of human history, losing at a contest meant being sent home without food, without shelter, without anything but your dignity, which didn't last very long. So it's easy to see why losing would cause a strong reaction. But that doesn't necessarily explain rage specifically. The anthropologist David Graeber wrote a book called Human Nature, The Time for War and the Time for Peace, in which he explores the connection between our biology and our behavior. He argues that humans are naturally predisposed to fight, but only under certain circumstances. These circumstances boil down to two factors: provocation and alcohol. Let's take provocation first. If someone cuts you off in traffic or steals your wallet, you might feel angry and want to confront them. But if they cut you off while you're driving a car full of family or steal your wallet while you're watching, you probably wouldn't think of fighting them as a valid response. The reason is simple. There's too much to lose. If you fight the guy who cut you off and win, you might get punched in the face. If you fight him and lose, well, yeah, you're gonna get punched in the face either way. And if you have family in the car or your wallet has your ID in it, there's just too much risk to reward for simply lashing out. So the danger has to be worth the potential gain. Alcohol enters the picture because it changes the risk to reward ratio. A small amount will lower inhibitions, making you more likely to engage in risky behavior. Like telling the guy who just cut you off exactly what you think of him. As we move forward in history, we start to see games that resemble modern ones develop. We can look to the ancient Olympics as a prime example of contests that didn't have super high stakes, but the winners still got a lot of respect. The Olympics weren't about eating or shelter, but they were about glory. However, we can find examples of deadly consequences for losing even earlier than the Olympics. You see, there were games that had fatal stakes throughout history. In ancient Rome, gladiators would fight to the death for the amusement of the crowds. Even before that in Greece, fighters would battle to the death in the sand games, so there's plenty of evidence that death is something that has been gambled away throughout history. Losing a fight could result in injury or death. This makes sense why people would get mad if they lost, whether or not they're fighting to the death. We know that people in those times didn't have the same coping mechanisms that we do today. Therapy wasn't around then, and no one was handing out participation trophies. They did, however, have alcohol. So we know that getting drunk enough to reduce your inhibitions was a thing. Can you guess what happened when highly competitive men drank lots of alcohol and then lost a contest that had social status and sometimes their lives at stake? They raged. We have accounts of gladiators who, after losing a fight, took their own life rather than suffer the humiliation of captivity. Now, obviously, we don't have these same practices today. You won't find any gladiators at your local esports tournament, nor will you find anyone taking their own life after losing a match. However, that doesn't mean that we don't still have similar tendencies in us. Now we need to jump ahead a few thousand years to the 2000s to a time when gaming became more mainstream and we started seeing more images of gamers raging online. This era of the internet was the perfect breeding ground for this behavior. The games were competitive, the stakes were high, and the audience was global. All of this mixed together gave gamers a chance to compete against each other like never before. If they lost, they'd be publicly humiliated by their peers and potentially ruin their chances of ever winning again. To get an idea of how bad things could get, you need only look to the infamous LAN party meltdowns of the early 2000s. LAN parties were a big part of gaming culture. Basically, it was like a house party, except instead of playing beer pong and talking about girls, everyone would set up their PCs and play video games together. It was a time for friends to get together and celebrate their shared love of gaming. Unfortunately, there was a darker side to LAN parties. In 2004, a Star Trek fan named Jonathan managed to sneak into the premiere of Star Trek: First Contact. That movie was released in theaters 10 years prior, but Jonathan wanted to see it anyway. He made his way into the theater and watched the entire movie without paying. After it ended, he was confronted by theater employees and asked to leave. Jonathan refused and was tasered by police. He survived the encounter, but his friends and family say that he's never been the same since. Jonathan suffered from severe social anxiety and couldn't hold a job for more than a few weeks. Eventually, Jonathan's condition forced him to drop out of college. His parents filed a lawsuit against the theater company, but it was dismissed. Jonathan died by suicide in 2017. Depression is a serious mental illness that should always be treated by a qualified professional. If you or someone you know is struggling with depression, please reach out to a trusted friend or family member. LAN parties took place from the late 90s to the mid-2010s, but they really exploded in popularity in the 2000s. During the height of LAN partying, players would go undefeated for months at a time and become legends in their communities. If you managed to beat them, though, you'd become the new legend. Some players even became so obsessed with remaining undefeated that they refused to play anyone who wasn't rated at least silver or higher. Others would refuse to play at all unless they were guaranteed a rematch if they lost. There were even cases of players refusing to shake hands after a match, both in victory and defeat. So, with so many bragging rights and social capital on the line, what would happen when someone actually did manage to best a legend? Sometimes it was met with grace. Some players were philosophical about their loss. They'd congratulate their opponent and move on, but others weren't so accepting of their loss. These people were the rage monsters. These guys existed on the fringe of gaming culture, but they were loud enough to make national news. Remember that whole CSGO gambling thing a few years ago? Yeah, that was nothing compared to the antics of LAN party rage monsters. One story involved a guy who lost a game and ripped off his headphones, causing him to bleed. Another player had to stop bleeding from his nose after being hit by his opponent's chair. Once a player smashed his monitor after losing and ended up cutting himself on the glass, leaving a permanent scar above his eye. Imagine a world where you can lose money, respect, and maybe even an eye just by playing video games. No wonder some people get upset. The story of the ancient Olympics is one of the most famous stories of all time. They originated in ancient Greece in the year 776 BC. Originally, the Olympic Games were a one-day festival honoring Zeus, king of the gods in Greek mythology. But eventually, the Games expanded to include several different competitions held every 4 years. The original Olympics included one event, a single foot race, but soon they expanded to include athletic events like wrestling and boxing. Eventually, they included musical competitions as well. However, they never included women. Women were forbidden from attending the Olympic Games until the 19th century, but they were allowed to participate in their own separate games, the Hurrian Games, The Hurrian Games were named after the wife of Zeus, Hera, and were held in her honor. Let's talk about the very first time that you ever tilted. Was it when you were playing Call of Duty? Was it when you were playing League of Legends? Or was it when you were playing a game in the arcade? When I was a kid, I used to go to the arcade with my dad. We'd go play Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Space Invaders, and Galaga. And he would always beat me at every single game, no matter what I did. Now, I know why now, but back then I just got more and more frustrated and angry. I wanted to beat my dad. He was showing off to me. I was 7 years old and I needed to win something for once. So we played Galaga, and over again I would get really close, but he would always get a little bit farther than me. And finally, I got so frustrated and angry, I started screaming at the machine. I hate this game. This game sucks. It's not fair. This machine sucks. I don't even remember what the score was or anything else about that day, but I do remember how I felt. This is called ego collapse, and it's the first stage of the process that leads to rage. So your ego gets crushed. You feel humiliation, and then eventually you explode, and you have an emotional outburst. But why does this happen? Why do we suddenly become filled with this overwhelming sense of rage? Well, if you look back at our evolutionary history, we can find the answers. Over millions of years of evolution, we developed certain reflexes to ensure our survival. When we are in danger, we fight or flight. Either we run away from danger or we fight the source of the danger. If we didn't have these reflexes, we would be dead. But humans are more than just animals. We are social creatures who depend on acceptance from others for our survival. And the most important thing for us is to maintain our reputation. We want other people to think that we are competent and skilled. We want them to respect us, but sometimes we fail. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we lose games. And when we lose, everyone sees it. Everyone witnesses our failure. And in those moments, we experience something very painful. We experience shame. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt is what you feel when you do something bad. Shame is what you feel when you are judged for doing something bad. Shame hurts a lot because it attacks our core belief that we are good people. It makes us feel like we are worthless and undeserving. It makes us doubt ourselves. And sometimes it drives us insane. In order to protect our fragile egos, we develop ways to hide our shame. We tell ourselves lies to convince ourselves that we are still worthy. We might say things like, "It doesn't matter. I didn't even try. I could win next time. Who cares?" But deep down, we know that what we did was wrong. We know we should have done better. Now, losing a game is not a big deal, but some people take losses very seriously. Some people literally cannot cope with losses. And in those cases, the pain becomes too much to handle. And that's when we explode. That's when we have an emotional collapse. That's when we tilt. There are two types of tilt. One is hot tilt, where you are fuming mad and you are going to explode at any moment. The other one is cold tilt, where you become so disgusted with yourself that you just shut down and you stop caring. Both types are destructive and they prevent us from winning games, but hot tilt is what most people think of when they hear the word tilt. So the next time you get tilted, ask yourself, when was the last time you experienced ego collapse? What made you feel humiliated? When does your ego collapse? Is it when you die multiple times in a row? Is it when you feed the enemy team? Is it when you miss a crucial shot? Or is it when you realize that you will never beat your father? Whatever it is, identify those triggers and try to understand them. Are they rational or irrational? Do they serve a purpose? Or are they just habits that you have developed over time? Once you figure out what causes your ego to collapse, you need to find ways to control it. One way to do that is to change your mindset. Instead of thinking in absolutes, instead of thinking in terms of wins and losses, try to focus on the process. Try to focus on what you can control. Try to focus on having fun. The goal is not to win. The goal is to enjoy the game. The second way to do that is to accept responsibility. Don't blame others for your losses. Don't blame teammates for throwing games. Don't blame lag or hackers or bad matchmaking. You are responsible for your actions. You are responsible for your attitude. You are responsible for your performance. By accepting responsibility, you will stop blaming others and you will stop blaming yourself. You will stop hating the game. You will learn to love the game despite its flaws. And that is the key to controlling your emotions. But the third way is probably the hardest way. The third way to control your emotions is to detach from the outcome. Detach from the result. Detach from the scoreboard. Detach from the criticism of others. Detach from your own self-criticism. Detach from everything except the present moment. Detach from everything except the game itself. When you detach from the outcome, you become free from the expectations that cause you stress. Have you ever seen a child cry because he lost a game? Of course you have. You're human. But as he cries, do you ever wonder what exactly it is that he's crying about? The answer is complex and goes much deeper than simply losing a game. It touches on the very nature of man himself. And if you don't believe me, just watch the first 5 minutes of this week's featured film, The King's Speech. Even royalty isn't immune to this primal fear. So why do gamers rage? Why does the simple act of pressing buttons in a completely safe environment cause such powerful negative emotions? We're gonna go back in time and find out. Ancient origins. When we think of ancient history, we picture a simpler time for sure. No internet trolls, no toxic work environments, no FIFA, but look closer. The signs are all there. It all starts with our ego, our sense of self-worth, which has been shaped by thousands of years of cultural and social conditioning. Our ego determines how we feel about ourselves and is directly responsible for our behavior. In other words, it's our personality. According to Jonathan Haidt, a professor of social and character education at New York University, the healthy development of the ego started around 3000 BC, when agriculture replaced hunting and gathering as the dominant means of food production. This forced humans to live in close proximity with each other and compete for limited resources, namely food. As humans began settling down and forming communities, they also began creating laws and hierarchies. These are some of the earliest records of public failure. Imagine being one of the first people in history who just so happens to be standing next to the pharaoh when he announces that you're now officially the property of the state because you didn't pay your taxes. Don't forget, the concept of zero tolerance wasn't invented by the TSA. It's been around since the dawn of civilization. Public failure meant being branded as an undesirable member of society, ostracized and ridiculed by your peers. Your reputation became your curse. This was especially true during the Middle Ages, when people were judged solely on their reputation and nothing else mattered. If someone believed you were a bad person, then you were a bad person. What's worse, though, is that the stigma often had little or nothing to do with your own personal actions. The Romans, for example, associated Germans with savagery and barbarism, partly because they made a habit of shaving their heads and dressing strangely. Apparently, the toga just doesn't get itchy. In those days, being part of a community meant submitting your ego at the altar of tradition. You couldn't think for yourself. You couldn't stand out. And this caused massive amounts of psychological distress. In fact, these extreme reactions to shame are still present in modern society. Just think of the Salem witch trials or McCarthy's blacklisting of suspected communists, where reputations were destroyed without any factual basis. For better or for worse, our egos are fragile things, and protecting them is instinctual. Enter rage. Rage is an emotional reflex that has developed over millennia to protect us from public humiliation and subsequent banishment from society. It's a last-ditch effort to save face when everything else fails. In other words, tilt is an ancient survival mechanism. The modern world, fast forward to today, and not much has changed. We still live in a society that judges us based on our accomplishments and image. We constantly compare ourselves to others and measure up to external expectations. According to a survey by the American Psychological Association, one of the greatest sources of stress in America today is looking good in a swimsuit. Can you even imagine a more stressful situation? When we fail to meet these standards, we experience negative emotions like shame and self-doubt, which can lead to anger. But we aren't condemned to a life of constant rage. It is possible to develop a healthy ego. One way to do this is by accepting responsibility for our mistakes instead of blaming external factors or circumstances. The goal isn't to avoid failure, but to learn from it and move forward in a healthy manner. Yet modern society makes this difficult. Not only does it glamorize and encourage antisocial behavior, but it's become synonymous with competition. In many ways, it seems that society is actually discouraging the healthy development of the ego. Consider the insane lengths people will go to for attention, whether it's posting half-naked pictures of themselves online or becoming infamous for outrageous stunts. All of these behaviors ultimately serve the same purpose, to gain recognition. But why does it have to be this way? Why can't we just be happy for others? Why does success make us resentful? The answer lies within us. Resentment. Resentment is the feeling that someone or something is unfairly preventing you from getting what you want or achieving your goals. It's a negative emotion that arises when we perceive a discrepancy between what we deserve and what we get. Think about it. If you spent weeks working on a project that you thought was brilliant, only to have it torn to shreds by your boss, you might start to feel resentment towards him. It's a natural response to perceived injustice, but it can quickly spiral out of control if not properly managed. Resentment is especially prevalent in competitive environments where people are vying for limited resources or positions. It can poison the workplace, ruin friendships, and even destroy families. So why is this happening? Why are we allowing ourselves to be consumed by bitterness and anger? The answer, once again, lies within us. According to psychiatrist Dr. Victoria Tarrant, resentment is a maladaptive response that stems from low self-esteem and feelings of helplessness. When we're consumed by resentment, we're really just trying to regain a sense of control. It's a way of coping with the frustration and disappointment we experience when we can't have what we want. But resentment can also be a form of self-protection. It allows us to distance ourselves from the pain and disappointment of failure by blaming someone or something else. In other words, it's a way of preserving our ego. Think about the gamer who refuses to accept that he's lost a match. Instead, he blames the referee for making unfair calls or his teammates for not supporting him. By doing this, he doesn't have to acknowledge his own shortcomings and can maintain the illusion that he's a skilled and capable gamer. But this is a dangerous game to play. Resentment can easily turn into obsession, which can lead to rage. Streaming failures. So far, we've established that rage is an emotional reflex that has developed over millennia to protect us from public humiliation, and that it serves as a maladaptive response to feelings of powerlessness and ego deflation. Now we need to talk about streaming failures because they're a perfect breeding ground for rage. Here's the thing about gaming. Despite the fact that it's an inherently solitary activity, we have somehow turned it into a performance art. Thanks to platforms like Twitch, we now have professional gamers who broadcast their every move to an audience of hundreds of thousands of people. And this creates a huge amount of pressure to perform. Imagine playing Call of Duty while knowing that hundreds of thousands of people are watching your every move. The stakes are high and the pressure is intense. A single mistake could mean the difference between victory and defeat, and your audience is counting on you to come out on top. The problem is that no human being can perform flawlessly under such high levels of pressure. We all make mistakes, but when you're in the public eye, those mistakes are magnified and scrutinized by a large audience. That's why streaming failures are always so explosive. They're the result of a buildup of pressure that has finally reached a breaking point. When a streamer tilts and lashes out at their audience, it's not because they're bad people. It's because they're human. They have egos and insecurities just like the rest of us. They experience the same range of emotions and are susceptible to the same psychological pressures. Streaming failures are a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how talented or skilled we are, we're all human and we all make mistakes. It's a lesson that we need to learn both as gamers and as spectators. Conclusion. As we wrap up our discussion on why gamers rage, it's important to remember that beneath the anger and frustration, there's a fundamental human need for acceptance and belonging. When we're driven by our ego and the desire to be recognized, we're essentially trying to fill a void of insecurity. But true fulfillment comes from within. It's a balance between our need for recognition and our ability to accept ourselves for who we are, flaws and all. We're all just trying to find our place in the world, and sometimes we stumble along the way. But it's in these moments of failure and frustration that we have the opportunity to show true strength and resilience. So let's strive to be better, not just for ourselves, but for the community of gamers everywhere. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to stay updated on future episodes. Thanks for watching. You lost 6 games in a row. Are you tilted? Maybe you're just having a bad day. But if you're feeling dejected, angry, frustrated, and vengeful, you're definitely tilted. And you're not alone. In recent years, psychologists have taken an interest in tilt, that irrational and sometimes extreme response some people have to losing, especially when it comes to video games. In fact, there's even such a thing as tilt therapy, which we'll talk about more later in the video. But first, why do people tilt? The problem with studying tilt is that it's hard to know where to start. So researchers started by narrowing their focus, looking at what happens in the brain when people lose and comparing that to what happens when they win. After all, it's just one of many ways people react to losing. One way they did this was with functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which measures blood flow to different parts of the brain. When subjects won at a simple hand-eye coordination task, researchers saw increased activity in the ventral striatum, an area associated with reward. But when the same people lost, there was increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, an area associated with cognitive control and emotion regulation. Other studies found similar results. In one study conducted at the University of Michigan, researchers had 20 male college students play a computer game where they had to match shapes as fast as possible. If a match was made correctly, the player got 10 points. But if there was a mistake, the player lost 5 points. But that still doesn't explain why some people tilt while others don't. The participants were hooked up to an electroencephalogram, or EEG machine, which measures electrical activity in the brain with electrodes placed on the scalp. So let's take a quick trip back in time. The researchers found that when the players lost points, there was increased activity in the parts of the brain associated with negative emotions. All of this suggests that tilting involves an actual physical response in the brain, kind of like a reflex. Or why sometimes people get so angry they smash their keyboards or throw their controllers. To answer that question, researchers started looking for the root of the problem, and they traced it back millions of years. In his book, The Righteous Mind, psychologist Jonathan Haidt describes how our sense of self evolved as a hierarchy. Picture our primitive ancestors living in small tribes. They hunted wild animals for food and competed with other tribes for territory. Above that is our personal identity, things like our likes and dislikes and hobbies. Life was tough and death was always around the corner. But even in this unforgiving environment, social standing mattered. Males who could hunt efficiently and defend their group were seen as heroes and had better access to resources, including females. You both belong to the same team, and your goal is to beat the other team. And that brings us to our first key concept, ego. What does that mean for you? Well, according to Haidt, your ego takes a hit. At the bottom is our self, which includes things like basic needs and drives. Above that is our social identity, how we see ourselves in relation to others. And at the top is our collective identity. As a result, you might feel ashamed, embarrassed, or even worthless. Even though the game is meaningless in the grand scheme of things, you feel compelled to defend your honor. This includes our religious beliefs, political views, and our membership in groups or teams. Picture a young boy separated from his tribe and lost in a dense forest. If he can't do that, he'll be vulnerable to predators and probably die. Every time he goes hungry, he experiences intense feelings of fear and anxiety, along with a sudden burst of energy. The higher up you go on this hierarchy, the more moral weight you assign to something. This sudden burst of energy is triggered by a hormone called cortisol. In other words, our collective identity is what gives things like winning a game their meaning. Let's say you're playing a video game with a friend. Now imagine that you make a mistake and your team loses. It means that you failed your team, and that failure reflects poorly on you too. The only problem is that none of these emotions are rational. But racing heart, sweaty palms, and yelling at the TV are all part of the same instinct. Researchers believe that tilt happens when you combine ego, hyper-emotionality, and a third ingredient, dopamine. You feel like you have to do something to restore your dignity. That's why some gamers throw their controllers or smash their keyboards. It happens whenever a reward circuit in the brain adapts to a certain stimulus. Your brain's reward system gets shut off, and instead of feeling motivated to play, you feel demotivated to keep trying. Every time you eat a chocolate bar, the reward circuit lights up. But after a while, the circuit adapts. They feel compelled to physically destroy the source of their humiliation. Your brain's reward circuit adapts, turning you off of playing. Unfortunately, there's no surefire way to prevent tilt. You need to either find a new source of reward or eat more chocolate to get the same high. Okay, so ego and shame are two pieces of the puzzle, but what about the rage? Why does losing make you so angry? To answer that question, researchers looked at another ancient instinct, this time on the individual level. Our next stop on the tilt time machine is the Stone Age. In this situation, there's only one thing on his mind: finding his way back to the tribe. Now imagine that this boy has to forage for food while he's searching for his tribe. Of course, that's easier said than done. And the truth is, nobody likes losing, but maybe tilt therapy can help. Taking a break is supposed to help you calm down before you jump back into the game. He runs around the forest, frantically looking for berries or fruit. And the combination of cortisol and anxiety is what researchers believe is responsible for our rage. Another found that having a cup of tea can calm you down. Other studies have had similar results. Next time you get tilted, just remember you're not alone. Basically, the fight or flight response turns your brain into a hyper-emotional time bomb. Either you give in to your anxiety and give up, or you trigger cortisol and go into fight mode and find the nearest saber-toothed tiger to wrestle. Losing sucks. In modern times, you might not run around the forest when you're tilted. In other words, it's human nature. Okay, now let's bring things back to the present day. If you're not a patron, but you want to learn more about what that means, you can go to our support page. Picture someone who regularly plays a video game. Every time they log in, they check their stats to see how they've been performing. They compare their wins and losses against other players and measure themselves against their own past performance. All of this is driven by dopamine. It feels good to check your stats because your brain is constantly looking for positive feedback. But what happens if your stats aren't looking so hot? This lack of motivation is what researchers refer to as the hedonic treadmill. Let's say you love eating chocolate. Eating chocolate doesn't give you as much pleasure as it used to. The same thing happens when you lose a game. So now you have everything you need to understand tilt. Ego, hyper-emotionality, and lack of motivation. Some people are more susceptible than others. But knowing the root of the problem can help. For example, in tilt therapy, one strategy is to remove yourself from the source of the problem. So if you're getting tilted while playing a competitive game, take a break and do something else. Just don't use that time to play a casual game. If you're tilted, you're tilted. Another strategy is to change your mindset. One way to do that is to think of losses as learning opportunities. By this logic, every loss is actually a chance to learn how to play better. It's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy where the goal is to help patients reframe negative thoughts. So if you're a patient and you say something like, "I'm so stupid," the therapist will help you reframe that thought. Instead of focusing on the mistake itself, focus on what you can learn from it. There are also physiological strategies you can try. One research study found that deep breathing can reduce anger and increase concentration. The key is to breathe deeply from your diaphragm. Not only does this send more oxygen to your brain, it calms down your fight or flight response. One study found that listening to music can reduce feelings of anger and frustration. As far as smashing your keyboard or throwing your controller, well, that's just property damage. You shouldn't do that. So there you have it. Tilt is an ancient reflex that's part of our primal nature. It as an ego threatened by a hyper-emotional brain, struggling to stay motivated by a reward system that's gone numb. Researchers continue to study tilt to figure out what causes it and how to treat it. But in the meantime, here's one thing they already know. Thanks for watching this episode. We've made educational videos over the years, so to all of our patrons, thank you for what you do to make this happen.